Hello and welcome to Sunday Storytime. Now today's story is all about ice lollies. Well, one ice lolly in particular, a glowing green ice lolly with special words written on the lolly stick. And it is this story, Ruby Nettleship and the Ice Lolly Adventure. A story written by Thomas and Helen Docherty and illustrated by Thomas Docherty. And thank you to Thomas for permission to read this story to you today. In the park by Ruby's house, there was an old falling apart playground. But one hot summer's day, that was about to change. This is Ruby Nettleship. She likes climbing and sliding and running and jumping. And when she isn't doing any of those things, she is dreaming of adventures. In the park by Ruby's house, there was an old, falling apart playground. The slide didn't slide. The roundabout wouldn't go round. And the sea had lost its soar. The only thing that did work was the swing, and there was always a big queue of children waiting to swing on it. One hot afternoon, Ruby and her friends had been waiting for ages when, crash, the swing came unswung. Now there was nothing to play on, and the children began to wander home. "Come on, let's go," called Ruby's friends. But something about the playground that day made Ruby want to stay. Without the other children, the playground felt even sadder than before. "No one cares," mumbled Ruby to herself as she tugged at the broken swing. "If this was my playground, there would be loads of brilliant stuff for everyone to play on." But just then, she was interrupted by the tinkle of an ice cream van. It drew up right next to Ruby. "Not many people here today," remarked the lady in the van cheerfully. "The swing broke," explained Ruby. "Well, that won't do," said the lady. "Here, have an ice lolly." And she handed Ruby a lolly in a green wrapper. "It's my last one." Ruby took the lolly. "Thank you," she remembered to say, but when she looked up again, the ice cream van had vanished. "That's strange," thought Ruby, turning her attention to the lolly. It was green, like the wrapper, but it seemed to glow from the inside. She took a bite. It tasted delicious. So she took another one, and another one, and another one. The letters P and L appeared on the end of the lolly stick. Ruby ate the rest of the lolly as quick as she could and held the stick up to examine it. It read, "Plant me." I wonder what will happen if I do, thought Ruby. No one was about, so she pushed the lolly stick firmly into the ground, covered it up, and waited. Almost immediately, Ruby felt a rumbling in the ground beneath her. She watched in amazement as a multicolored shoot pushed its way up through the soil. It shot up into the air, nearly hitting her on the nose. Once it had grown to twice Ruby's height, it sprouted new branches that twisted and turned into a beautiful swing. "Wow!" cried Ruby. She climbed aboard and launched herself into the air. As Ruby started to swing, more shoots appeared. They quickly sprouted ladders and poles that blossomed and bloomed with swings and slides. Ruby was swinging so high by now that she could see over the whole of the city. "I bet no one else is having this much fun," she thought to herself. Then Ruby had an idea. As if it had read her thoughts, the playground flowered over the whole park and began to spill out into the street. The first thing Ruby did was to pick up her friends and all the other children who lived nearby. "This way!" shouted Ruby, and with that they headed off towards town. On the way, they dropped in at the zoo to see if the other animals wanted to come out and play. And look, they did. What can we see? We can see elephants and seals and polar bears and penguins all swinging and sliding on the slides. After the zoo, they visited the supermarket and made a giant trolley roller coaster. Look at that supermarket. By the time they got into the centre of town, the playground was full to bursting. Even the grown-ups had climbed out of their cars, put down their shopping, forgotten about work, and joined in the fun. Soon the whole city had ground to a halt. "Now what?" wondered Ruby. As if in answer, the playground twisted round and headed towards a very important-looking building. Before Ruby had a chance to say anything, she was tipped gently in through an open window. Ruby found herself standing in front of a huge door with "The Mayor" written on it. "Now I'm in trouble," thought Ruby. There was nothing else to do, so she took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," said a voice that sounded vaguely familiar. "Ruby Nettleship, I didn't realise that your playground was going to take over the whole city," remarked the lady sitting behind the desk. I'm sorry," said Ruby. "All I wanted was a place for everyone to play where no one has to wait for ages for the swings." "I see," replied the lady. "Perhaps you'd better go home for tea and I'll see what I can do." "Okay," said Ruby, sneaking a quick look out of the window. "Thank you," she remembered to say. But when she looked back, the lady behind the desk had vanished. Suddenly, Ruby felt very hungry, so she climbed out of the window and whispered one last word to the playground. As everyone slid home, it untangled itself from the city and disappeared back into the ground, leaving everything just as it had been. "You're back late," said her mum when Ruby got home. "Sorry," replied Ruby. "There was a big queue for the swing." Ruby's dad shook his head. "Someone should do something about that playground," he said. Ruby smiled to herself. Maybe someone will. And you know what? Ruby was right. Look at that brand new playground. And that was the story of Ruby Nettleship and the Ice Lolly Adventure. Join me next week for another Sunday story time. Until then, bye for now.